When Lewis Hamilton stepped out of his SF25 after qualifying in Hungary, he didn't wait for the usual post-session debrief or data analysis. He didn't ask about tyre pressures, wind gusts, or traffic on his final push lap. He simply pulled off his gloves, leaned against the pit wall, and said it out loud: "I was absolutely useless today." In a sport where every tenth of a second is often wrapped in technical justifications or political spin, Hamilton's brutal self-assessment cut through like a clean overtake into turn one. At the Hungaroring, a track he once dominated with almost casual brilliance, he had just been knocked out in Q2, position 12 on the grid, and as the cameras caught the moment, there was no shouting, no fury, just a quiet collapse of belief. The seven-time world champion, now in red, was in the midst of what may be his most psychologically challenging race weekend in over a decade. But it wasn't just the lap time, it was what it symbolized. For Hamilton, this wasn't about Hungary, it was about everything that led to this. The switch to Ferrari, the faith in a new project, and the creeping realization that belief alone can't fix fundamental flaws. Because this wasn't an isolated misstep, this was a culmination. The telemetry from qualifying told a sobering story. Through Sector 1, Hamilton was nearly 2/10 off his own free practice benchmark. His braking trace showed earlier releases at turn 5, indicative not of caution, but a lack of trust, either in the front-end grip or in the stability of the rear under compression. His engineer Riccardo Adami tried to lift the mood over the radio, but even that fell flat. Hamilton, used to the consistent rhythm and emotional synergy of Bono at Mercedes, now sounded like a man out of sync, not just with his car, but with the system around him. And while Ferrari team principal Fred Vasseur publicly backed his driver, extending his own contract just weeks earlier, even he couldn't spin the reality. Hamilton was struggling, and he knew it. Come race day, the narrative didn't improve. Hamilton lost places on the opening lap, dropping to position 14 before the field had even spread out. A short first stint on mediums left him vulnerable to undercuts from midfield runners, and the attempted recovery lacked the bite that once defined him. Verstappen swept past with DRS into turn 2, a move that wasn't just clinical, it was telling. Hamilton, boxed in on tyre strategy, had no fight back. No late charge, no rain to shuffle the deck, just position 12 at the flag, one lap down, no points. And for the first time in his Ferrari tenure, a finish that was forgettable not because it was catastrophic, but because it was irrelevant. In a season of momentum shifts and political battles, Hamilton had become background noise. And that, for a man who once defined the front page of Formula One, may be the most painful signal of all. To understand why this Hungarian Grand Prix weekend felt so seismic, not just for Lewis Hamilton, but for Ferrari as a whole, you have to rewind to the narrative arc Ferrari had carefully been constructing all season. This wasn't meant to be a rebuilding year. With Hamilton's blockbuster signing finalised in the twilight of 2023, the message was clear. Ferrari wasn't just chasing podiums, they were hunting legacy. The SF25 was supposed to be the canvas for that pursuit. A car born from the hard lessons of 2024's mid-season collapse and shaped by a design team emboldened by technical freedoms under the latest regulation tweaks. Early in the year, there were flashes of brilliance. Leclerc took pole in Imola. Hamilton led laps in Canada. But those flashes masked a deeper inconsistency, one that became impossible to ignore by the time the circus arrived in Budapest. Ferrari had built a car that was quick over one lap when the stars aligned, but brittle under pressure, unpredictable in traffic, and disturbingly sensitive to ride height, aero yaw, and track temperature. And in Hungary, those variables weren't forgiving. The heat was relentless, the track evolution steep, and the midfield fiercely compact. Teams like Aston Martin and Alpine brought aggressive updates, and the McLaren package, refined since Silverstone, was suddenly dominant. But what hurt most was the intra-team contrast. Charles Leclerc looked like a driver in control. Pole position on Saturday wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a public dagger through the heart of Hamilton's weekend. Same car, same conditions, same data. Yet one driver made it sing, the other couldn't make it talk. Yet beneath the headlines and broadcast graphics, the real story was beginning to simmer. Because while Hamilton was dealing with a car that felt foreign in his hands, the whispers within the Ferrari garage grew louder. Reports began surfacing, quietly then more boldly, about diverging setup philosophies between the two drivers. Leclerc had reportedly pushed for a stiffer rear and aggressive rake angle, favouring rotation into slow-speed corners, while Hamilton's camp pushed for stability and mechanical grip. The result? A car that increasingly looked tailored to Leclerc's driving DNA. And in a year where development tokens were tight and every millimetre of bodywork had championship consequences, Ferrari couldn't afford to split the difference. The compromise was gone. The car was drifting toward one philosophy, and it wasn't Hamilton's. The technical unravelling of Hamilton's Hungarian Grand Prix begins not with his Q2 exit, but with the subtle shifts in Ferrari's development arc over the past 3 rounds. While the headline narrative was all about Leclerc's pole and Hamilton's collapse, the more revealing story came from telemetry traces, setup sheets, and internal engineering decisions that pointed to a widening philosophical split between the two drivers. Hungary's layout, short straights, tight hairpins, and medium-speed sweepers, demands a car that can rotate sharply at low speeds without sacrificing rear traction on exit. But the SF25, already known for its sensitivity under load transfer, showed its most extreme behavioural variance, yet when placed in Hamilton's hands. His complaints of rear instability during FP2 weren't generic gripes. They were symptomatic of a car tuned to thrive on an edge Hamilton was no longer willing to walk. Telemetry from qualifying paints a vivid contrast. Leclerc's throttle traces through Sector 2, the most technical part of the circuit, showed earlier commitment and smoother exit application through turns 8 and 9. Hamilton, by contrast, was feathering the throttle longer, suggesting either a mechanical balance he didn't trust or a rear end that wasn't giving him predictable grip under lateral load. Brake traces showed Hamilton releasing earlier into turns 5 and 12, a classic compensation for rear instability. That wouldn't have mattered if Ferrari had adapted. But the issue, insiders revealed, wasn't just Hamilton's driving style, it was the team's unwillingness to shift setup priorities mid-weekend. And it wasn't just mechanical balance at play. The SF25's floor was revised after Silverstone to increase rear downforce by accelerating airflow through a modified Venturi tunnel architecture. That change helped Leclerc extract more mid-corner rotation, but Hamilton's camp flagged a side effect: increased rear-end porpoising under compression at tracks with aggressive camber changes. The Hungaroring, with its elevation shifts and heavy lateral G-loads, brought that issue to the forefront. During FP3, Hamilton's car showed micro-bouncing through turn 13, compromising traction onto the main straight, a crucial overtaking zone. The power unit side wasn't helping either. Hungary's lack of long straights means ERS deployment becomes a chess match. Leclerc optimised for maximum harvest through Sector 3, timing full deployment for the DRS zone into Turn 1. Hamilton's data revealed inconsistent energy deployment patterns, likely a result of lift and coast adjustments made to stabilise tyre temperatures on the softs. It was a layered technical breakdown, aero, mechanical and electronic systems all drifting out of alignment. But here's what really mattered. Ferrari's engineering staff had chosen a side, and that side wasn't backing Hamilton's preferences anymore. If the technical breakdown exposed Hamilton's struggles with the car itself, the strategic decisions on race day revealed a deeper, more structural problem: Ferrari's operational clarity, or lack thereof. Starting from position 12, Hamilton was always going to be vulnerable to the undercut, especially at a circuit like the Hungaroring, where track position outweighs raw pace. Yet despite this, Ferrari opted for a conservative medium-hard-medium strategy, mirroring Leclerc's from the front of the grid rather than tailoring a bespoke approach from the midfield. That decision raised eyebrows in the paddock. The race unravelled in stages. Hamilton's first stint saw him stuck in a DRS train behind Pierre Gasly, with no room to extract clean air pace. When Ferrari finally pitted him on lap 18, the timing was late enough that several rivals, Norris, Russell and even Alonso, had already leapfrogged him via the undercut. Even more telling was the tyre offset Ferrari failed to exploit. With both hard and medium compounds showing similar lap time deltas after lap 25, Hamilton's second stint lacked the grip advantage needed to make meaningful progress. By the time he re-emerged in position 15, he was mired behind a hard-charging Yuki Tsunoda. Compare that to Leclerc's race up front. When the Monegasque reported early front graining, Ferrari brought him in 2 laps ahead of schedule, keeping him ahead of the McLarens and into clean air. The strategic flexibility Leclerc was afforded stood in stark contrast to Hamilton's rigid framework. Multiple radio exchanges from Hamilton throughout the race hinted at frustration, not just with pace, but with the decision-making process itself. "Are we sure this is the right call?" he asked during the final stint, referring to the timing of his second stop. No direct answer came back. It's in the quiet moments, off the track, beyond the telemetry and the lap charts, where the real pressure of Formula One reveals itself. And for Lewis Hamilton, the 2025 Hungarian Grand Prix was not just a mechanical failure or a strategic misfire. It was an emotional reckoning. After 2 decades in the sport, 7 world titles, and a career spent commanding respect through both performance and presence, Hamilton now finds himself in a role he's never fully occupied, the second narrative at Ferrari. It's a position that carries a unique kind of weight, because Ferrari, more than any other team on the grid, lives on emotion, politics, and mythology. And in Budapest, the myth that Ferrari had found their messiah in Hamilton began to fracture, not through scandal, but through shenanigans. There was no visible argument between Hamilton and his engineer Riccardo Adami post-race. No slammed helmets or shouted recriminations. But that silence spoke louder than any outburst. Insiders reported that Hamilton lingered in the garage longer than usual after the race, staring at the data screens as Leclerc's crew gathered around the pole sitter, dissecting what could have been a victory had their own strategy held up against the charging McLarens. For Hamilton, there were no such debriefs, only analysis of how a weekend went sideways with no single moment to blame. The relationship between Hamilton and Leclerc, once framed as a respectful mentorship rivalry dynamic, is beginning to strain under the weight of contrasting trajectories. While Leclerc grows more comfortable asserting himself as the team's anchor, meeting with Vasseur privately after sessions, shaping development decisions, Hamilton has found himself more on the outside of those conversations. Not excluded, but not central either. His calls for a different setup philosophy have been met with half measures. His race strategy, questions answered with procedural affirmations rather than collaborative problem solving. The media is picking up on it too. Post-race coverage in Italy was particularly sharp, with La Gazzetta dello Sport questioning whether Ferrari had mistaken the poetry of Hamilton's legacy for present-day pace. The English press, often protective of their champion, couldn't mask the disappointment. An uncharacteristic lack of fire, one Sky Sports commentator said, describing Hamilton's race demeanour. That absence of fire, whether tactical or emotional, now raises deeper questions. Has Ferrari already emotionally aligned itself with Leclerc as their future, leaving Hamilton as the short-term PR play that no longer fits the evolving architecture of the team? With 10 rounds remaining in the 2025 season, every result now carries an amplified weight, especially in a title fight this compressed. And while Hungary was a personal defeat for Lewis Hamilton, its implications for Ferrari's championship prospects are far more intricate. Charles Leclerc, despite starting on pole, finished 4th after a compromised pit strategy allowed both McLaren's and Max Verstappen to leapfrog him in the closing laps. But critically, he still banked 12 points, enough to keep him within striking range of Lando Norris and Verstappen, who now sit 1st and 2nd respectively in the Drivers' Championship. Leclerc currently trails Norris by just 19 points. Hamilton, by contrast, is now 86 points off the lead and clinging to 7th place in the standings. For Ferrari in the Constructors' Championship, they remain 3rd, but Hungary saw McLaren extend their lead in 2nd by an additional 18 points. Red Bull continues to accumulate enough consistent points to remain a distant but stable leader. What this means is simple. Ferrari's window for a Constructors' push is narrowing, and they now face a brutal internal calculus. How much resource, development time, and strategic flexibility should be allocated to a Hamilton car that's consistently failing to convert weekends into points? Mathematically, Hamilton's chances of a late-season surge into title contention are slim. Even if he were to win 3 of the next 4 races, a feat no Ferrari driver has managed since 2018, he would still depend on repeated failures from at least 2 other title contenders to claw back the difference. The more pragmatic, and perhaps more political question now facing Ferrari, is whether to quietly prioritise Leclerc as their sole championship contender. Ferrari has always existed on the knife edge between glory and dysfunction. From the political theatre of the early Schumacher era, to the heartbreaks of Felipe Massa and the volatility of Sebastian Vettel's tenure, the Scuderia's history is a mosaic of brilliance and chaos. And if Hungary 2025 felt eerily familiar, that's because we've seen this storyline unfold before. The dynamic of a world champion entering Maranello with hopes of rewriting destiny, only to find themselves eclipsed by a younger, more embedded teammate, isn't new. Fernando Alonso faced it in 2014 with Kimi Raikkonen's surprising late-season resurgence. Vettel saw it with Leclerc himself in 2019. The signs were there before Hungary. At Monaco, a strategic error buried Hamilton behind traffic all race long, while Leclerc was granted priority on tyre selection. In Canada, an experimental rear suspension geometry, pushed by Hamilton's side, was quietly shelved after a single Friday session, deemed too unstable for competitive deployment. These aren't overt signs of sabotage, they're historical echoes. Ferrari as a team tends to coalesce around momentum, and right now, that momentum favours Leclerc. Beneath the political undercurrents and personal dynamics lies the real spine of Ferrari's 2025 campaign, the SF25 chassis and the iterative technical philosophy behind it. This is not a radically different car from last season's SF24, but rather a carefully evolved machine, an aerodynamic refinement built on simulation insight, not conceptual reinvention. The team's goal was clear: reduce peakiness in downforce delivery, improve longitudinal grip under braking, and maximize straight-line efficiency without compromising cornering stability. Central to the SF25's identity is its aggressive floor architecture, designed to harness ground effect more consistently across high and medium-speed corners. The update introduced ahead of Silverstone, featuring recontoured Venturi tunnels and modified edge-wing strakes, was meant to stabilize rear-end aero behavior under yaw, and it worked. For Leclerc, his trail-breaking approach, which leans on late rotation and sharp front-end rotation, matched perfectly with the update's benefits. But for Hamilton, who historically prefers a car that allows for smooth throttle roll-on and minimal rear-end unpredictability, the changes compounded discomfort. Further complicating Hamilton's adaptation was Ferrari's revised suspension concept. The front pushrod system, in combination with a stiffer rear torsion bar setup, was intended to reduce mechanical roll and improve front-end response, ideal for Leclerc's style, but twitchy under braking for Hamilton. Engineers reportedly trialled asymmetric damping maps in FP2, attempting to tame rotation on corner entry without sacrificing exit grip. But the results were inconclusive, and no significant changes were implemented for qualifying. On the power unit side, Ferrari's internal combustion engine remains one of the grid's strongest in peak output, but its energy deployment strategies remain overly conservative compared to Red Bull and McLaren. In Hungary, where efficient ERS management is key due to short recharge zones, Ferrari's conservative mapping again hampered Hamilton. He often exited DRS zones with depleted battery levels, leaving him vulnerable on straights. While Ferrari grappled with the internal imbalance between their two drivers, their rivals were anything but idle. The Hungarian Grand Prix saw McLaren deliver a statement of intent, Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri executing a flawless 1-2 finish that wasn't just a victory on paper, but a strategic dismantling of the opposition. The team's mid-season upgrades, introduced incrementally since Austria, have come together with stunning cohesion. Their latest floor evolution, paired with subtle tweaks to front wing end plates and rear suspension geometry, allowed for improved low-speed rotation and reduced tyre degradation over long stints. McLaren's resurgence has added a new axis to the championship calculus. Where Red Bull had once looked unchallenged, they now find themselves sandwiched between two threats: Ferrari's one-lap brilliance and McLaren's race day consistency. But unlike Ferrari, McLaren's driver management is resolute and unified. Andrea Stella has created a clear strategic hierarchy, but without undermining team cohesion. Norris is the de facto leader, but Piastri receives race decision parity, ensuring that no internal drama derails forward momentum. Red Bull, too, is recalibrating. Verstappen's race in Hungary, though not dominant, was another example of adaptive excellence. Starting from fourth and finishing third, he outmaneuvered Leclerc with precision DRS deployment and aggressive ERS usage in key zones. More tellingly, Red Bull's long-run performance suggested they're holding performance in reserve. Ferrari, by contrast, showed visible tyre drop-off after just 14 laps, an issue not addressed despite repeated data flags from both cars. The fallout from Hungary isn't just about lost points, it's about lost momentum, and in Formula One, that can be fatal. With Spa-Francorchamps just days away, the contrast in car characteristics and track demands will push Ferrari into an uncomfortable spotlight. Unlike the tight, technical confines of the Hungaroring, Spa emphasises high-speed balance, aerodynamic efficiency, and energy deployment under full load. On paper, this should be a reset opportunity for Ferrari, a track where raw engine power and straight-line speed can offset mechanical imbalances. For Hamilton, Spa is more than just another race. It's a litmus test for whether his influence within Ferrari can be recalibrated. Behind closed doors, he's already pushing for setup divergence from Leclerc, demanding increased mechanical compliance and suspension mapping better suited to his smoother throttle profile. But those changes require commitment, not just in engineering hours, but in philosophy. If Ferrari continues developing toward Leclerc's style, Spa could see Hamilton locked out of the top six once again. On the constructors' front, the stakes are escalating. Ferrari's current third position is under direct threat from Mercedes, who, despite lacking outright pace, have maintained consistent point hauls through disciplined race execution. If Hamilton continues to finish outside the top 10, Ferrari's buffer will evaporate. That will inevitably spark difficult conversations within Maranello's leadership about resource allocation, upgrade paths, and even the unspoken question of whether the team's 2025 objectives remain realistic. Meanwhile, the broader implications stretch into 2026. The new regulation cycle is just one season away, and teams are already starting to shift CFD and wind tunnel assets toward next-gen designs. If Ferrari allows internal driver imbalance to fester now, they risk entering that new era without cohesion. Precisely the scenario that crippled Red Bull in the post-2014 hybrid transition and Mercedes in the early 2022 aero reset. The Hungarian Grand Prix may ultimately be remembered as the inflection point that reshaped Ferrari's trajectory, not just for 2025, but for the seasons to come. At the heart of the matter is identity. Ferrari's legacy has always been defined by dominance through unity. Moments in time where car, driver, and leadership converged into a singular, championship-winning force. But in the post-Schumacher era, that unity has been elusive. Hungary didn't merely expose operational gaps or a car with a narrow setup window, it revealed a team grappling with conflicting timelines. Charles Leclerc represents the long game, a driver in his prime, fluent in the culture, fully embedded in the development loop. Lewis Hamilton, by contrast, is the living symbol of short-term ambition, a proven winner brought in to fast-track Ferrari's return to glory. Ferrari now faces a strategic dilemma. If they continue down the path that favours Leclerc's development preferences and places him at the centre of race strategy, Hamilton becomes a tactical liability. His feedback may still be valuable, but his relevance to the championship arc diminishes. Conversely, if Ferrari tries to maintain equal footing, they risk engineering ambiguity, creating a car that satisfies neither driver and allows rivals like McLaren and Red Bull to solidify their technical advantages. Then there's the branding layer. Hamilton's arrival was more than a sporting decision. It was a cultural event. The commercial value of Ferrari's partnership with the most successful driver in modern Formula One cannot be overstated, but if he continues to underperform, that narrative becomes a burden. Sponsors, fans, and media outlets begin to question the wisdom of the move. And within Ferrari, a brand obsessed with perception, that questioning has consequences. As the sun set over the Hungaroring paddock and the last mechanics packed away the remnants of a bruising weekend, the story of the 2025 Hungarian Grand Prix settled into something larger than a disappointing race result. It became a referendum, not just on Lewis Hamilton's adaptation to Ferrari, but on Ferrari's ability to manage the immense gravity of its own expectations. Hungary was the weekend where the illusion of balance within the Scuderia fractured in full view. The myth of equal machinery, equal opportunity, and equal say gave way to something colder and more familiar. Strategic favoritism, wrapped in technical justification. But Formula One is nothing if not cyclical. Spa is next. And with it comes the chance for Hamilton to remind the paddock and himself why he was brought into this team in the first place. Ferrari's SF25 is still a fast car in the right conditions. The power unit remains formidable, and Spa's long straights and high-speed corners could reduce the impact of the setup inconsistencies that crippled Hamilton in Hungary. But beyond all of that, the real challenge will be political and psychological. Can Hamilton assert himself back into the centre of Ferrari's decision-making process? Can he regain the trust of a garage that is clearly leaning toward Leclerc as the default reference point? For Ferrari, the path forward is equally complex. They can't afford public fractures or mid-season resets. The Constructors' Championship is still mathematically alive, and Leclerc remains a legitimate title contender. But continuing to sideline Hamilton, intentionally or not, comes with risks. His experience in development, his understanding of high-pressure campaigns, and his leadership in chaotic race scenarios are intangible assets that no simulator can replicate. The long-term view stretches further still, as 2026 looms, and with it a radical overhaul of regulations. Ferrari must decide now what kind of team it wants to be. Is it a legacy-driven machine centered on a youthful future? Or is it still a place where proven greatness can shape new eras? Hamilton's continued presence, relevance, and results may ultimately answer that question. Because Hungary wasn't just a wake-up call, it was a warning A warning that talent without alignment is a wasted asset, that machinery without trust is just metal and data, and that even the greatest driver of a generation can find himself powerless if the team around him forgets what he came to build. And now, as Formula One charges towards Spa and beyond, all eyes are not just on the stopwatch, but on the Scarlet Garage, watching, waiting, and wondering what happens next.